May 21st, 1979. It is known as the White Night Riot, when grief and anger turned into a furious battle on the streets of San Francisco after assassin Dianne Feinstein received a sentence of voluntary manslaughter for the double murders of Mayor George Moscone and Harvey Milk, the city's first openly gay supervisor. Dianne Feinstein came from San Francisco's Visitation Valley, one of 9 children from a working-class Irish Catholic family. He had been an Army paratrooper during the war in Vietnam, then served his city as a cop, fireman, and supervisor. In November of 1978, White assassinated Moscone and Milk at City Hall. The madness was both tragic and incomprehensible. Just 9 days before, the city's heart and soul had been ripped apart by the shocking murder-suicides of some 900 members from San Francisco's People's Temple in Jonestown, Guyana. When the bloodlust continued with the killings at City Hall, it was a brutal climax to one of the darkest chapters in the history of San Francisco. In the decade of the 1970s, San Francisco was the Wall Street of the West, a labor town becoming Manhattanized, visited by millions of tourists, and embraced by a wave of new immigrants, creating a gay mecca in a neighborhood called the Castro.
I want to give fair warning to the pessimists who may be among my constituency that we can accomplish what we set out to do.
To George Moscone, San Francisco was the greatest city in the world.
George Moscone was bigger than life. He was a very ebullient character. He loved politics. He loved the rough and tumble of it.
Moscone was an only child raised by his mother in the city's Cow Hollow district. He was a high school basketball star at St. Ignatius, graduated from Hastings Law School, registered black voters in Mississippi, and served in the California legislature as a liberal progressive Democrat.
My father was always for the little guy, the underdog.
In 1975, George Moscone was elected mayor of San Francisco. Moscone was 46 years old, married, and the father of 4 children.
He really felt close to this city. This was his city. And for the people to vote him into office, the city that he was born and raised in, it meant everything to him.
Moscone wanted to transform the face and soul of San Francisco and made enemies. He believed the city's police department needed change and supported advances in the hiring and promotion of blacks. Moscone also made a controversial move in appointing a liberal outsider, Charles Gaine, as the new chief.
George was unusual in that he didn't naturally come from a background where people of color were, but for whatever reasons, George was without any evidence anywhere of any racism or whatsoever.
Dianne Feinstein has worked and lived virtually all his 31 years in this southeastern section of San Francisco.
The neighborhood problems are the city's problems. You see, the transportation, the crime, the education, the taxes.
In the summer of 1977, Dianne Feinstein ran for city supervisor from District 8.
One of the campaign statements he makes is that the city is being blighted by people unlike ourselves, malignancies he calls them, and it was generally interpreted to mean that he was talking primarily about gay people.
White was a married, straight-arrow conservative who believed in family values and campaigned to the music of Rocky and a slogan of "Unite and fight with Dianne Feinstein." White was easily elected.
Dianne Feinstein comes across as the kind of son almost any mother would be proud of.
Dianne was one of my big supporters here.
As a teenager, Dianne Feinstein was an all-city football player, thrown out of high school for fighting. As a cop, he went against the police code of solidarity, charging another officer with brutality. As a fireman, he saved a woman and her child from a burning building.
Yes, I like Dianne Feinstein very much. I thought that he was a hard-working young man.
San Francisco homicide inspector Frank Falzon was a friend of Dianne Feinstein's. Cops from the same neighborhood, they were the double-play combination on the department's softball team.
Compromise and what happens at City Hall on a daily basis was just not Dianne Feinstein's mentality. And I felt personally, as a friend, he was making a mistake.
Joining Dianne Feinstein on the city's Board of Supervisors was Harvey Milk. Milk was the first openly gay man elected to public office in the history of San Francisco.
What really counts is a person care. Does a person care about his city or her city?
Harvey Milk's early life was eclectic. High school athlete, college graduate, Navy officer, Wall Street businessman, Goldwater Republican, ponytailed anti-war demonstrator who settled in San Francisco in 1972 and opened a camera store on Castro Street.
Harvey was a lot of fun. Harvey was a fast-talking, glib, energetic, theatrical New York Jew.
He wasn't a saint. He had a temper. He could be a real pain in the neck. You know, he was just this guy that moved us.
In the days after his election, Harvey Milk recorded a political will.
This is to be played only in the event of my death by assassination.
As a very public gay man, Milk knew he could be assassinated.
In my election, gave somebody else, one more person, hope. And after all, that's what it's about. You gotta give them hope.
As the months passed, many of Harvey Milk's colleagues grew concerned about Dianne Feinstein and his working-class politics and biases. Milk felt White could be educated.
Harvey tried to reach Dianne with humor. He tried to reach Dianne with advice.
Harvey could be a bit Machiavellian. I think he looked at this more as a game than most people do, and he kind of walked to the sound of his own drummer. I know that he and Dan were very close. They had coffee once a week, and they talked a lot, which was kind of interesting.
Dianne Feinstein felt a certain kinship for Harvey Milk. When Dan's son, Charlie, was born, at the christening, Harvey Milk was the only member of the Board of Supervisors that Dianne Feinstein invited to this very personal event.
Eventually, Harvey Milk and Dianne Feinstein became political adversaries. It began with a controversial proposal to place the Center for Troubled Teens in White's Visitation Valley neighborhood. White fiercely campaigned against it. When Milk voted in favor of the center, White was humiliated and enraged. He retaliated by opposing Milk's gay rights bill for San Francisco.
You can have someone that's a transvestite, a man that, for his sexual kicks or orientation, whatever you want to call it, loves to dress up as a woman. If he is a qualified teacher, he can go into any school or he can go into any business and they can't refuse him.
Dianne Feinstein was the only supervisor to vote against the gay rights ordinance of Harvey Milk. The relationship between the two men never recovered.
And Dan, with every month that passed, got more and more frustrated, more and more, I think, self-conscious and aware that he wasn't succeeding. And I think these frustrations were clearly growing and growing. And in that arena, if you aren't smart, you lose.
In 1977, Anita Bryant, a Miss America runner-up and television orange juice queen, led a successful campaign in Florida to overturn a gay rights ordinance. That victory launched a new battle against homosexuals across the nation.
You are opening up the floodgate to a situation that is like the Holocaust.
A year later, John Briggs, a conservative legislator from Orange County, placed an initiative on the state ballot which would ban gays and lesbians from teaching in California schools.
Let me get you straight now, you know, Harvey. I've been very patient.
Harvey Milk worked tirelessly to defeat Proposition 6, the Briggs Initiative.
And hopefully the vote we see now continues, and the people of California will have stood up to a demagogue and said goodbye.
On November 7, 1978, the Briggs Initiative lost by over 1 million votes. It was the apex of Harvey Milk's political power. But Dan Whyte's promising political career was fading, his contempt for City Hall growing.
He was a lousy politician. He had a high school civics notion of what politics was about. He thought you all got together in a big fancy room and everybody said what they believed sincerely, and the best argument won.
Whyte was also having financial problems. His wife, Mary Ann, left her teaching job to take care of their first child. To supplement his supervisor's salary of $9,600 a year, the couple borrowed money and invested in a fried potato stand at Pier 39.
He's real unhappy in his job, and he's real unhappy with how hard his wife has to work, and he's real unhappy that his opponents are beating him up day in, day out politically.
I happened to see an interview by one of my colleagues was interviewed the other night, and he kind of chuckled, and his statement was, Supervisor Whyte didn't realize that he has to compromise, and I won't compromise my values or my standards.
On November 10th, 3 days after the defeat of the Briggs Initiative, Dan Whyte surprised everyone and resigned his position as a San Francisco supervisor.
Harvey, I think more than Moscone, Harvey saw now that with Dan's resignation, the mayor had an opportunity to appoint a liberal and change the balance on the board.
On Monday, November 13th, Dan Whyte's resignation was officially accepted by the Board of Supervisors. Whyte's nameplate was removed from the door of his office. But special interest groups did not want to lose Whyte's conservative vote.
The Chamber of Commerce had said, you can't resign. You have, you're the sixth vote that we need because the mayor had just a bare majority of votes. You can't resign. Police officers, you can't resign. Firefighters, you can't resign.
Whyte was persuaded to change his mind after a contentious meeting with his aides on the afternoon of November 14th. The ex-supervisor then informed Mayor Moscone that he wanted his old job back. Moscone agreed that a man has the right to change his mind. He will rescind Whyte's letter of resignation and reappoint him to the board. Harvey Milk was shocked.
And then Harvey went to Moscone and said, what the heck are you doing? This is our vote. This is the majority.
Late this morning, Dan Whyte appeared for his official unresignation announcement, saying his brothers and sisters have given him help with his financial problems, and a lot of his constituents have asked him to reconsider.
The majority of my district doesn't want to have someone appointed that they did not elect, that they wish me to stay in my seat, remain in my seat, and this is what I'm going to do.
But in fact, opposition to Dan Whyte was growing.
And when he got ready to go back in, he didn't call any of his rank and file out there.
On November 16th, an angry group of anti-Whyte demonstrators voiced their disapproval.
But the way he did it, he treated us like we was peons. Right. You see, he treated us like we was peons.
Whyte was there and got into a brief flare-up.
Wait, Dan. Dan,
service
I'll
to the
let you
community
talk. Now,
to San Francisco.
What
And I'll end it right there.
Okay, Dan. Okay, Dan.
Produce it Monday. Go to Supervisor, 2 o'clock. Produce it.
He's a yo-yo at this point, and everybody but him understands he's not going to get his job back.
But the timeline of Dan Whyte's City Hall soap opera would be interrupted by a lunatic preacher and cult leader from San Francisco. In a South American jungle, thousands of miles from the city, an unthinkable tragedy was about to shock the world. Bay Area Congressman Leo Ryan came to Jonestown, Guyana, to investigate the Reverend Jim Jones and his People's Temple. On Saturday, November the 18th, at the landing strip of the Port Kaituma Airport, Ryan and 4 others, including an NBC News crew, were ambushed and shot to death. But the airport killings were only the beginning. Within hours, a mass suicide murder had also taken place. Over 900 men, women, and children, including Jones, were dead. The Sunday morning calm of San Francisco on November 19th was shattered when the headlines detailed the evil of Jonestown. By Thanksgiving weekend, the Dan Whyte situation had become an emotional roller coaster for everyone. Dianne Feinstein, president of the Board of Supervisors, urged Mayor Moscone to reappoint Whyte. Moscone informed the press he has not committed to Whyte.
He's struggling financially, he's struggling personally, and apparently he's struggling emotionally.
I do know that Dan Whyte overheard a conversation between Harvey and the mayor, in which Harvey urged the mayor not to reappoint Dan. And Dan apparently felt very betrayed.
On Friday, the 24th, Mayor Moscone celebrated his birthday, his 49th. That evening, Harvey Milk attended a performance of Tosca at the city's Opera House. 2 days later, on Sunday night, a radio reporter called Dan Whyte, wanting his reaction to the news that he will not be reappointed. Whyte responded with no comment.
He is beginning to withdraw in some fairly serious ways. He's staying home, he's depressed, he's feeling sorry for himself, and eventually he just quit being decent altogether, and he murdered 2 men in cold blood.
November the 27th. It is the day when San Francisco will be touched by evil once again. Mayor George Moscone will announce Dan Whyte's successor to the board. Whyte decides he wants to see the mayor at City Hall.
He showers, he shaves, he puts on his best suit.
At around 10:15 a.m., Whyte arrives at the Polk Street side of City Hall. He is carrying a loaded .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver in his holster.
He goes in the front entrance, and there is a metal detector, and of course he's got a weapon on him, so he turns around, he leaves. He climbs into a window instead and comes up through a back staircase, and he goes into Moscone's outer office. He does not know, but in Moscone's inner office at that moment are sitting George Moscone and his good friend Willie Brown.
Oh, we shot the breeze. We shot the breeze about a whole number of things. We shot the breeze about the 49ers football fortunes, and they were not great in those days. We shot the breeze about our own family relationships, what we were thinking about for Christmas. We used to Christmas shop together for our wives.
The mayor is informed by his secretary that Dan Whyte wants to see him. At around 10:40, Whyte enters Moscone's office.
Dan Whyte walked in as I walked out.
Whyte asks the mayor if he will be reappointed. Moscone tells him no. The ex-supervisor becomes agitated. The mayor lights a cigarette, offers Whyte a drink, and tries to reason with him. It is too late.
And he pulls out the gun and he shoots George Moscone once, twice. George Moscone falls.
The bullets tear into the mayor's chest and arm.
Dan Whyte straddles him, puts the gun to the back of his head, and shoots him twice more.
Moscone is dead. After killing the mayor, Whyte is seen running to the other side of City Hall. He is looking for Harvey Milk.
Dan went by, and I said, "Dan," and he said, "In a minute." And I heard a door slam.
After Whyte finds Milk, they meet in Whyte's former office.
I heard shots.
Dan Whyte fires his weapon 5 times into Harvey Milk, twice point blank into Milk's brain.
I walked into the room. Harvey was on his stomach, and I tried to get a pulse, and I put my finger in a bullet hole, and he'd clearly gone like this, and a bullet had gone through his wrist, and it was absolutely clear that he was dead.
After killing Harvey Milk, Whyte flees City Hall. He calls his wife Mary Ann and tells her to meet him at St. Mary's Cathedral. City Hall is in turmoil. Officials fear a Jonestown death squad.
Yeah, where are the evictions going? I don't know if they're going anywhere. They're supposed to, Harvey Milk and the mayor are supposed to be DOA.
As president of the Board of Supervisors, it's my duty to make this announcement. Both Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed. The suspect is Supervisor Dan Whyte.
Just rage. I wanted to say to Harvey, I told you. Just rage.
It was like I was getting hit with thunderbolt punches. I'm being told that the mayor's been shot and killed. I'm then told that Dan Whyte is a suspect. Dan Whyte was a close friend. And then I walk in and I see the mayor of San Francisco lying in a pool of blood. Not only disbelief, but I have to be honest, at this point in time, I was one shaken detective.
As soon as word of the shootings reached the house at 45 St. Francis Boulevard, police, neighbors, and reporters began to mill around. A few of the family's close friends became unofficial spokesmen, greeting other friends and answering what questions they could. 3 of the mayor's children, Christopher, Jonathan, and Rebecca, were already inside by the time the older daughter, Jennifer, arrived.
A cop tells 16-year-old Chris Moscone about the death of his father.
And I asked him, "What's going on?" And he looked at me, it's just me and him, and he said, "Son, you don't know?" I said, "No." He goes, "Your father has expired." Those are the words. That's the first I heard.
Ironically enough, the mayor's wife, Gina, at the time of the shooting was with his mother, attending a cousin's funeral in Petaluma.
On the way home, Gina Moscone hears the news of her husband's murder on the car radio. Close friend Willie Brown is among those who visit the family.
Gina didn't take it well at all. Did not take it well at all. So it was a difficult task. But it was one that I know that George would have wanted me to do.
Attention all units, former Supervisor Dianne Feinstein is now in custody. Repeating, former Supervisor Dianne Feinstein is now in custody. KMA 438 clear.
Dan, why you do it? Dan, why?
After Dan White surrenders at Northern Station, he is transported to homicide at the Hall of Justice. He will be interrogated by 2 inspectors. One of them is Frank Falzon.
If he was going to tell anybody as to why he committed those 2 murders, I was the man.
Just all the time knowing he's going to go out and lie to the press and tell them, you know, that I wasn't a good supervisor and that people didn't want me, and then that was it. Then I just shot him.
Within 25 minutes, a tearful and emotional Dan White confesses, first to killing Mayor George Moscone, then Supervisor Harvey Milk.
He just kind of smirked at me, as if to say, too bad. And then I just got all flushed and hot, and I shot him. How long?
Falzon will be criticized by those who believe he allowed White's confession to be self-serving.
They couldn't take it anymore, and that's it.
I felt I was doing my job sending a friend, Dan White, to the gas chamber.
Outside, San Franciscans came by the thousands to City Hall. They were just staring in space. It was as if the people could not believe what happened really happened. They had to come to see for themselves.
Doesn't make any sense.
Flowers were placed on the steps of City Hall. Someone wrote a poem. It was unsigned. All afternoon, people milled around, staring in space, in shock.
When darkness falls, City Hall remains a shrine of public grief. Thousands gather by candlelight. Days later, mourners pay their last respects and say their goodbyes to both George Moscone and Harvey Milk.
In the wake of the tragedies in Guyana, this additional senseless monstrosity seems simply unreal. Yet our anguish and grief permeate everything we do. We silently rail at the manifest injustice of these untimely deaths. We cry out to reverse the irrevocable. In our sorrow, this lovely jewel of a city seems a dark and saddened place.
After services at St. Mary's Cathedral, the family of George Moscone escorts his body to the Holy Cross Cemetery in Colma, where he is buried. Friends of Harvey Milk scatter the ashes of his cremated remains in the waters beyond the Golden Gate Bridge.
There was an atmosphere of deep and abiding gloom, paranoia, and fear in the city. And I think what happened at City Hall has to be remembered in that context. It didn't just happen one day. It happened when the city was already in a state of shock and emotional recoil at one tragedy. And then the second event happened, and it was as if the world had ended.
Frankly, I don't have enough information to really gauge his state of mind. I'm of the opinion that he's in a prolonged state of shock.
Doug Schmidt, a 32-year-old Hastings Law School graduate from the Midwest, was the attorney for Dan Whyte.
He's a man that had what I would term hollow eyes. He had kind of it wasn't a blank look on his face, but he just had a vacancy.
The trial of Dan Whyte began on May 1st, 1979. Whyte was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and faced the death penalty. Attorney Schmidt presented a defense of diminished capacity, that Whyte suffered from mental depression at the time of the killings.
That a decent, hard-working, working-class, middle-class man who has held responsible jobs all of his life and been in public service all of his adult life does not suddenly, for no apparent reason, viciously murder 2 individuals. Something had to have happened to this man.
The jury was composed of 5 men and 7 women, mostly white, middle-aged, and working class.
And someone noticed that there were 5 out of the 12 jurors of an age to be Dan Whyte's mother, and every one of them were Irish Catholic.
Schmidt brought in 4 psychiatric experts to testify for the defense. Dr. Martin Blender examined Dan Whyte before the trial. Blender did not admire Whyte or his politics.
So I walked into that room expecting just some sort of right-wing, homophobic man that I would find distasteful. And the man that I found was very different than the man I expected to find. And when I finished my interviews, I felt sorry for him, and my biases and prejudices as to why he did what he did went out the window as I myself, like the jury 2 months later, became aware of all the complex inimical forces impinging on this man that caused him to snap and do what he did.
When Dr. Blender took the witness stand, his lengthy testimony strongly supported the defense theory of diminished capacity. Blender also briefly explained that during Whyte's frequent depressive episodes, Whyte would start gorging himself on junk foods, Twinkies, Coca-Colas.
It was a minuscule part of the picture we were trying to portray.
It was also very controversial. The press sensationalized Blender's junk food testimony by calling it the Twinkie defense.
That certainly wasn't the main thrust of the defense, that one eats junk food, goes crazy, and is allowed to kill people.
There was another courtroom surprise when Dan Whyte's confession was played.
The prosecution played that confession, I think believing that it was sort of the nail in the coffin of first-degree murder, probably with special circumstances. A death penalty case, dead bang on its face.
No, I never killed anybody before. I never shot anybody.
But the tape was a disaster for the prosecution.
What struck me very vividly at the time was that every time Dan Whyte cried, and he cried repeatedly in this confession or was overcome by emotion.
Well, it's just that I never really intended to hurt anybody. It's just that these past several months, it got to the point I couldn't take it.
And I was sitting there thinking, in my naivete, how self-serving. And I looked over at the jury box, and there were no less than 4 jurors crying. And I realized at that moment, as I think a lot of people did, Dan Whyte was going to beat this rap to a considerable degree.
On the afternoon of May 21st, 3 weeks after the trial began, the jury had reached its verdict.
Trial, Janine Yeomans, right here. What is it?
Yes, the jury has found Dan Whyte guilty of voluntary manslaughter in the killings of both George Moscone and Harvey Milk.
Dan Whyte had faced the death penalty. He was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. Whyte's sentence was 7 years and 8 months. Attorney Doug Schmidt was pleased with the verdict. Many others were not.
It was like, wow, this is not right. This verdict that's just been turned in isn't right. I think Dan Whyte knew himself that this was 2 first-degree murder cases. Dan Whyte did get away with murder.
Jurors deliberated for 6 days. As for their decision, the jury foreman stated, no one could come up with any evidence that indicated premeditation.
I think it was a living testament to the polarization of San Francisco at the time. And I think this jury felt sorry for Dan and had mercy and pity.
In the Castro, there was neither sympathy nor pity, only disbelief and anger. Thousands marched to City Hall in protest. Gays had reached the breaking point.
Oh, absolutely. It was payback time.
And the crowd grew and grew and grew, and it became more and more and more unruly. And I saw a crowd become a mob.
The cops were outnumbered. Police Chief Charles Gain decided to hold his men back, fearful City Hall would be overrun if the cops took on the angry crowd. But the rage and fury could not be controlled.
It was just crazy. It was chaos.
After the riot at City Hall had dissipated, cops descended on the relative calm of the Castro, and the bloody battle ignited once again. One of the worst assaults took place at the Elephant Walk Bar. To some observers, it was an invasion, cops wanting revenge. When peace was finally restored, a dozen police cars had gone up in flames. Over 150 cops and civilians were injured, dozens arrested.
I thank God no one was killed, but it was what had to happen. We have nothing to apologize for.
In January of 1984, Dan Whyte was released from California's Soledad prison and paroled to Los Angeles. A model prisoner, Whyte served less than 5 years of his original sentence.
I asked Con Murphy, who was my chief of police, to go down and see him and tell him not to come back to San Francisco. That the feelings ran so deep that there was no way he would ever be able to come back to San Francisco and lead a normal life.
When the Olympic Games were being held in Los Angeles in the summer of '84, Dan Whyte called his old friend Frank Falzon. Whyte had tickets for the track and field events and invited Falzon to be his guest. The ex-convict made a shocking last confession.
Dan Whyte explained to me that he intended on that fateful day to kill 4 people, those 4 being George Moscone, Harvey Milk, Carol Ruth Silver, and Willie Brown.
According to Falzon, Whyte believed Willie Brown was the ringleader of the liberals, that Supervisor Carol Ruth Silver was the biggest snake of all.
He had a mission to kill 4 people and then take his own life. He felt that the liberal ilk of San Francisco had destroyed him as a person, had ruined his reputation with his family and his friends, and his life was over. And he even laughed and said, "How crazy could I have been?" He knew what he did was insane. It was that point in time, the entire picture of all the events that had occurred became very, very clear. Dan Whyte did, in fact, commit premeditated murder in the first degree.
Despite warnings to stay away, Dan Whyte returned to San Francisco in 1985.
And of course, he couldn't readjust. The pain is so deep, the scar tissue, so horrendous, that I think he had to lead a shadow life.
On the morning of October 21st, Dan Whyte committed suicide in the garage of his Visitation Valley home. Whyte created his own gas chamber as he sat inside of his car, a hose pumping in the deadly fumes of carbon monoxide. He was 39 years old. Inspector Frank Falzon was on duty that day and was called to the scene.
When we arrived, there was a priest giving him the last rites, 2 Catholic nuns kneeling down over his body, praying. And I remember thinking, this is just so surreal. It was unbelievable.
I felt no satisfaction. I wanted him to live a long time and be confronted daily with the scorn of the people of San Francisco.
Dan Whyte is buried in the Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno. Whyte left behind a wife, 3 children, and a legacy marked by uncommon tragedy and extraordinary change. According to Dr. Martin Blender, his participation in the Whyte case made him persona non grata among his gay and liberal friends. His connection to the so-called Twinkie defense was irrevocable.
It's troublesome to me that the press, which essentially conjured up this myth of the Twinkie defense, would continue to perpetuate it over 25 years.
A member of the jury stated that Dan Whyte's junk food diet was not a major factor in their deliberations. The juror added, "I don't think we spent 5 minutes on it."
To reduce those subtleties and those complexities to a soundbite like, well, it was the Twinkie defense, suggesting that 12 middle-class, ordinary, home-owning jurors would find Dan Whyte less culpable because of what he ate, is not only laughable but preposterous.
Too much is made of the Twinkie defense. It was catchy, and so it caught on because every reporter ran back to their TV station or their newspaper and said, "Twinkies, the Twinkie killings," and Martin Blender took a bad rap for that.
Praise for Dianne Feinstein, however, was universal during and after the sad days of the assassinations.
San Francisco is not going to be rudderless in this time of transition. Government will continue.
Feinstein's calm, reassuring demeanor became a symbol of strength for a troubled city. Her political career ascended like the proverbial phoenix. After serving 2 full terms as mayor of San Francisco, Feinstein was elected to the United States Senate in 1992. The legacy of Harvey Milk is unmistakable. If Milk was not the first gay martyr, he was certainly the most public and the most important. Milk's epitaph resonates with the rise of the gay movement, not only in San Francisco, but in America as well.
He was only in office for 11 months, but his murder galvanized a movement and probably did more than any other single event to make real the notion that there is a gay community and that we are a people. That's his legacy.
The years following the death of Mayor George Moscone were difficult ones for his entire family. As a basketball player at St. Ignatius High School, Chris Moscone suffered the insensitive chants of Dan Whyte's name. Today, Chris Moscone is happily married, the father of 5 children, a lawyer in San Francisco. Gina Moscone has never remarried. Though the city has gradually moved beyond the murderous acts of Dan Whyte, San Francisco's historic image as a place of tolerance and celebration was forever tarnished.
He took the heart out of the city. It was never the same place again. It never has been the same place. I think to a certain degree the specialness went out of it in the same precise way that a certain sense of idealism went out of America with the assassinations of the 2 Kennedy brothers and Martin Luther King. Suddenly we could no longer look at ourselves in the mirror and say, we're special, we're unique, we're different. We weren't.